New York City, 1985. A man is leaving a club on the Lower East Side. Gold chain around his neck, cash in his pocket. The kind of night where everything feels like it belongs to you, where the music was right and the city outside feels like yours. He doesn't see it coming. Someone steps out of the dark, takes the chain, takes the cash, takes everything worth taking, and disappears before anyone can process what just happened. No name given, no face remembered clearly, just gone, back into the Brooklyn night like he was never there. But everyone in that world knows who does this. His name moves through the underground economy of New York the way fire moves through dry grass. Dealers talk about him. Kingpins warn their people about him. Men who have built reputations through years of violence speak his name with a specific kind of respect, the kind reserved for someone who operates by rules that even the most dangerous men in the room don't fully understand. He robbed everyone: dealers, runners, kingpins, and eventually the most famous rappers in New York City. Men with bodyguards and reputations and the kind of street credibility that was supposed to make them untouchable. Nobody was untouchable to him, and the greatest rapper who ever lived, the God MC himself, put him on his album cover. His name was Benjamin O'Garrow. Fort Greene, Brooklyn. They called him Killer Ben N. Fort Greene, Brooklyn, 1960s and 70s. The Walt Whitman houses sit on Myrtle Avenue in one of Brooklyn's most historically layered neighborhoods, named after the poet who lived in Fort Greene in the 19th century. Walt Whitman, the man who wrote Leaves of Grass, who celebrated the democratic American spirit, who believed in the dignity of every human life, had his name on a housing project that would become one of the most dangerous addresses in the 1980s in Brooklyn. The irony of that naming is something Fort Greene residents lived with every day. The poet who wrote about democracy and dignity, the building where dignity was one of the hardest things to hold on to. Fort Greene was not always dangerous. In the 1950s and 60s, it had been a working-class neighborhood with a strong black community, families who had migrated from the South during the Great Migration, who had built lives in Brooklyn, who owned small businesses and attended the same churches and sent their children to the same schools. The neighborhood had culture. The Brooklyn Academy of Music sat on Lafayette Avenue. Fort Greene Park, designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, the same man who designed Central Park, gave the neighborhood green space and dignity. The Fort Greene houses, built in the 1940s, had originally been considered a model of public housing, clean, safe, well-managed. Then the money left. As white families fled Brooklyn for the suburbs through the 1960s, the city's investment in Fort Greene's infrastructure went with them. Buildings that had been maintained fell into disrepair. Schools that had been funded were starved of resources. The economic floor that had held the community stable began to crack. By the 1970s, Fort Greene was struggling. By the time Benjamin O'Garrow was a teenager in the early 1980s, the crack cocaine epidemic had finished what the disinvestment had started. Crack changed Fort Greene the way it changed every black neighborhood in New York. Not gradually, overnight. Suddenly, there was a drug that cost less than a meal, but created the kind of addiction that made people sell everything they owned. Suddenly, there was money, more money than most residents had ever seen, available on corners to young men who were willing to do what it took to get it. The violence that came with it was specific and relentless. Benjamin O'Garrow grew up in all of that. He made a specific decision about what kind of man he was going to be. Not a dealer, not someone who stood on a corner selling to addicts, not a kingpin building a distribution network that required management and discipline and the careful cultivation of supplier relationships. A stick-up kid, the most feared kind of criminal in the underground economy, because he didn't follow any of its rules. Dealers had codes. There were things you didn't do. You didn't rob civilians. You didn't bring violence near children. You didn't target the wrong people. Kingpins had alliances, agreements, territories that were respected because respecting them was in everyone's interest. Stick-up kids operated outside all of it. They robbed dealers, robbed runners, robbed anyone who was carrying something worth taking. What made Killer Ben different from other stick-up kids in a borough full of dangerous men was his fearlessness. Not recklessness, fearlessness. There is a difference. Reckless men take stupid risks because they don't fully process consequences. Fearless men take calculated risks because they have decided that consequences don't change what they're going to do anyway. Benjamin O'Garrow was the second kind. He would walk into situations that other men would assess and walk away from. He would target people who other stick-up kids considered untouchable because nobody was untouchable to Killer Ben. He operated by a single principle. If you had it, he could take it. The reputation spread through Brooklyn the way reputations spread. Through stories, through accounts, circulating in prison yards and on corners, and through the oral history that the streets maintain about the men who matter. By the time he was in his early 20s, Benjamin O'Garrow's name carried weight that most men spend entire careers trying to accumulate. He had earned it the hard way, the only way he knew. Here is the detail that separates Killer Ben from every other Brooklyn stick-up kid. In the mid-1980s, a DJ named Eric B. was building something new. He had found a rapper from Wyandanch, Long Island, a young man who called himself Rakim, whose lyrical sophistication was unlike anything that had existed in hip-hop before. Where other rappers of the era used simple rhyme patterns and straightforward storytelling, Rakim moved between bars with a fluid, almost jazz-like rhythm. He referenced philosophy and scripture. He approached the microphone with the calm authority of a man who knew he was the best in the room. Together, Eric B. and Rakim were building what would become one of the greatest debut albums in the history of American music. They called it Paid in Full, and the name came from a specific source. The Paid in Full Posse was a real organization, a notorious New York collective of street figures and rappers who moved through the same world simultaneously. Men who existed at the intersection of hip-hop culture and the underground economy. Men who were present at the same parties, the same clubs, the same corners, where the music and the streets overlapped. The Paid in Full Posse included Kool G Rap, one of the most technically gifted rappers of the era, Freddie Fox, an MC whose intensity was unmatched, and two men who were not rappers at all, Killer Ben, and a man from Crown Heights, Brooklyn, who the streets called 50 Cent. His real name was Kelvin Martin, and the reason they called him 50 Cent had nothing to do with money in the way most people think about money. Kelvin Martin would rob you. He would take your jewelry. He would take your valuables. He would take everything you had on you, and then he would leave you 50 cents. Not because he needed the money, because he wanted you to know that he had taken everything else and left you with almost nothing deliberately. The 50 cents was the message. The 50 cents was the humiliation. The 50 cents said this: I could have taken this too. I chose not to. That choice is mine. Your dignity is mine. It was psychological warfare, conducted one robbery at a time. His exploits became legendary across New York in the mid-1980s. They were covered by local media and referenced in hip-hop lyrics before any rapper named Curtis Jackson ever existed. When Curtis Jackson from Queens decided to take a stage name in the late 1990s, he didn't invent the name 50 Cent. He borrowed it, specifically, deliberately. He said so publicly. The name was inspired by Kelvin Martin, a 1980s Brooklyn robber known as 50 Cent. I chose it because it says everything I want it to say. I'm the same kind of person 50 Cent was. The most successful rapper in the world in the early 2000s, the man who built a business empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars, had named himself after a Brooklyn stick-up kid who ran in the same circle as Killer Ben. That is the world Killer Ben moved in. Not just a stick-up kid on a corner, a man whose crew, whose combination of street credibility and cultural presence was powerful enough that the greatest MC in hip-hop put them on his album cover, and powerful enough that the name of one of his running partners became the most famous stage name in the history of rap music. 1988. Benjamin O'Garrow is 19 years old. By now, his reputation in Fort Greene is fully established. His name circulates through the streets the way dangerous reputations circulate, through stories told on corners, through accounts passed between men in prison yards, through the oral history Brooklyn maintains about men who operate at the level Killer Ben operates. He is not yet 20 years old, and he is already someone that grown men in Fort Greene speak about carefully. Then, in a Fort Greene playground, he faces the situation that will define everything that follows. A shootout erupts. What started it is not fully documented in any public record. Disputes in that world rarely are. What is documented, reported by DNA Info, and circulated through every account of Killer Ben's life is what happened in the middle of it. Killer Ben, surrounded and under fire in a playground full of children, grabbed a 4-year-old child and used that child as a human shield, not in a moment of confusion that could be explained away. Deliberately, calculated, the child was cover. That detail became the defining fact of how the rest of his short life would be understood. In a world where violent men are judged by a specific code, where there are things you do and things you don't do, lines that even the most feared men are expected to respect, using a 4-year-old child as a shield crossed every line simultaneously. The people who respected Killer Ben respected him anyway. His reputation was too established, his standing too real, to be fully erased by one act. But the act was never forgotten, never fully defended. It sat in the middle of the Killer Ben mythology, the way uncomfortable truths sit, acknowledged, contextualized, and ultimately irreducible. He was convicted of attempting to murder a police officer, sentenced to federal prison. He went away in 1988 at age 19. He would not walk the streets of Fort Greene again for 7 years. And while he sat in that cell, the cost of being Killer Ben arrived at his family's door. 1990. Fort Greene, Brooklyn. Killer Ben is in prison. His brother, a younger man not connected to the street life the way Ben was, not someone who had chosen what Benjamin had chosen, gets into a dispute. A shootout. Details absorbed into the incomplete record that Fort Greene keeps about its most painful moments. But the men involved in that dispute know the family name. They know what it means. They know where the O'Garrows live. That same night, they come to the front door. They shoot it up. Killer Ben's youngest brother, a child, is killed. An innocent boy, never a gang member, never involved in anything his older brother had built. Dead because of the name he carried at birth. Dead because reputation in that world does not stay contained to the person who earned it. It radiates outward to the family, to the address, to everyone associated with the name. Ben is somewhere in a federal prison when word reaches him. He cannot go home. He cannot bury his brother. He cannot be present for the grief that sweeps through his family. He cannot do the thing that every instinct he has developed over 19 years of life in Fort Greene tells him needs to be done next. He sits with it, in a cell, for years. The mural that Fort Greene would eventually paint in his honor the bright-faced young man with the sharp jaw and the sharp hairline, the words "a cut above the rest" beneath his dates does not show any of that weight. Murals show the legend, not what it cost. 1995. 7 years after he went in, Killer Ben comes home. Fort Greene has changed while he was gone. Or more accurately, it has continued the transformation that was already underway when he left. The crack epidemic has peaked and begun to give way to heroin. The open-air markets that had defined the late 80s drug trade are being restructured under the pressure of federal enforcement. But the streets are still the streets. And hip-hop, which had been an underground New York phenomenon when Killer Ben went to prison, has become something else entirely while he was away. Hip-hop is now public, visible, and profitable. Biggie Smalls is about to release Ready to Die, the debut album that will make Christopher Wallace from Bed-Stuy the most celebrated rapper in America. Jay-Z is recording in studios across Brooklyn. The Source Awards, the biggest annual night in hip-hop, are bringing the entire industry to Manhattan. And the artists moving through that world are wearing wealth publicly. Gold chains, diamond crosses, jewelry that cost tens of thousands of dollars, worn openly, displayed deliberately because the jewelry was both real wealth and proof of authenticity. It said, "I came from where I said I came from. I built what I said I built." Killer Ben looked at all of that and saw opportunity. Opportunity. His name was already part of the mythology. A popular 1991 song had mentioned him. Rakim had put him on an album cover. In the prison yards and on the corners where the real New York oral history lives, Killer Ben was a name that carried weight. But weight doesn't pay rent. He went back to what he knew, the streets of Fort Greene, the networks he had built before he went away, the fearlessness that had built his name, and he started robbing rappers. 1995, the Source Awards, Manhattan. The 1995 Source Awards are one of the most infamous nights in hip-hop history. The night Suge Knight took the stage and called out record executives who put themselves in their artists' videos, a thinly veiled shot at Diddy that ignited the East Coast-West Coast rivalry that would eventually cost both Tupac and Biggie their lives. That is the story everyone knows about that night. Here is the story nobody reported. Biggie Smalls is there with his junior mafia crew. An associate named Zach is wearing a gold chain. After the show, the chain is gone. No police report filed, no public acknowledgement. The kind of robbery that gets handled the way things get handled in that world, quietly, with the understanding that what happens next happens outside the legal system. Word comes back through the streets. Killer Ben had something to do with it. Benjamin O'Garrow, the man from the Walt Whitman houses, the man on Rakim's album cover, the man who had used a 4-year-old as a human shield and served 7 years and come home and gone straight back to the life, had robbed someone connected to the most famous rapper in New York. According to former NYPD detective and author Derek Parker, who documented this era in his book, Biggie and Killer Ben may have clashed directly in 1995, months before Ben was murdered. August 17, 1995, Myrtle Avenue, Fort Greene, Brooklyn. Benjamin O'Garrow is 26 years old. He is standing at a payphone on the street where he grew up, the street he went to prison from, the street he came home to, the street where he learned that mythology doesn't pay rent and went back to the life because the life was the only thing he fully knew how to do. He has been home from prison for less than a year. In that time, he has reestablished himself. The Source Awards robbery, the network of contacts he maintained through 7 years of federal incarceration, the reputation that had survived his absence and in some ways grown in it, because absence in that world sometimes amplifies a legend rather than diminishing it. He is standing at a payphone, having a conversation, and somewhere nearby, a man with a .40 caliber handgun is making his way toward Myrtle Avenue. The shot comes without warning. Benjamin O'Garo is shot dead at the payphone on Myrtle Avenue in the Walt Whitman Houses neighborhood, 2 blocks from where he was born. 26 years old. The murder was never solved. No arrest was ever made. The circumstances, whether it was retaliation for the Source Awards robbery and the chain taken from Biggie's associate Zach, whether it was connected to the reported direct clash between Killer Ben and Biggie in those final months of 1995, whether it was something else entirely from the long list of enemies that a man like Killer Ben accumulates over a life lived the way he lived it, were never publicly established. Former New York Police Department detective Derek Parker documented in his book that Killer Ben and Biggie may have clashed in the months before his death. Parker was a working homicide detective in Brooklyn during this era. His account is the closest thing to a documented record of what the relationship between Killer Ben and the bad boy world looked like in those final months, but nobody was ever charged. The case stays open in the same way that cases like this always stay open in Fort Greene. Technically active, practically cold, the truth somewhere in the oral history of the streets rather than in any police file. Killer Ben died the way he lived, on his street, in his neighborhood, with no warning and no time to react. The phone call he was making when the shot came, nobody knows who was on the other end of the line. Nobody knows what the last words of Benjamin O'Garo were. Just the sound of a .40 caliber handgun on Myrtle Avenue. And then silence. Fort Greene, Brooklyn, today. On the corner of Vanderbilt and Myrtle Avenues, directly across from the Walt Whitman houses, where Benjamin O'Garo was born, grew up, went to prison, and came home, there is a mural. His face, young, a bright-faced young man with a square jaw and a sharp hairline. The face of someone who never made it to 30, who never had the chance to become whatever a man like Benjamin O'Garo might have become if the streets had given him more time. Above the image, the words that the people who loved him chose. Our never-ending love for you. Your memories will always shine through. Below the painting, a cut above the rest, and his dates. November 5th, 1968. August 17th, 1995, 26 years. That is all. The mural was painted by the community that knew him, that had grown up around him, that had watched him become Killer Ben and understood, the way communities that produce men like him always understand, that the legend and the man were two different things, that the man had a mother, had brothers, had a birthday and a childhood before he had a reputation. The mural was defaced by people who felt that painting a tribute to a man convicted of attempted murder who had used a 4-year-old child as a human shield was the wrong message for a neighborhood still trying to find its way forward. They had a point, and then the mural was repainted by people who felt that Fort Greene had the right to remember its own, in full, with complexity, without the sanitized version of history that pretends communities do not produce men like Killer Ben and do not grieve them when they are gone. They also had a point. Both things can be true simultaneously. The man was complicated. The legend was real. The grief was genuine. Fort Greene painted him back on the wall, and Rakim had already made sure that the name survived beyond the wall. The God MC, who changed what rap could be, who brought a level of lyrical intelligence to hip-hop that nobody had brought before, who is considered by serious students of the music to be the greatest rapper who ever lived, had put Killer Ben in his songs, had put him on his album cover, had acknowledged him as part of the world that produced both the music and the violence, the crack-era Brooklyn energy that defined everything Rakim was speaking to. Tragedy Gaddafi, one of the most respected lyricists in New York hip-hop, had put him in a verse, bidded with Killer Ben and the real 50 Men. The original 50 Cent, not Curtis Jackson, the real man who carried that name before it became one of the most famous brands in entertainment history, had run in the same circle. Kelvin Martin, Crown Heights, Brooklyn, the man who would rob you and leave you 50 cents because the 50 cents was the message, because your humiliation was part of the transaction, because the point was never just the money. Curtis Jackson named himself after that man, said publicly, "I'm the same kind of person 50 Cent was, the most commercially successful rapper of the 2000s, the man who turned Get Rich or Die Tryin' into 12 million album sales, the man who survived 9 bullets in a South Jamaica parking lot and used the story to build a global brand, named himself after someone from the same world as Killer Ben. That is the world Benjamin O'Garrow moved in. Not a footnote, not a cautionary tale. A man who was genuinely part of the cultural DNA of the era that produced the music your entire generation listened to. He robbed every rapper in New York. He got put on an album cover by the greatest MC who ever lived. His running partner's nickname became the most famous stage name in the history of rap music. And he died in a phone booth on Myrtle Avenue at 26 years old. The mural is still there, defaced and repainted. Fort Greene remembers. Subscribe to Bloody Reports. There are 1,000 stories like this one that nobody has told the right way yet. This was one of them.